All right, thank you very much. I will, I think probably pretty obviously, be speaking English today, and I'll try to go nice and slowly so that we can get a clear translation. I'll be playing one video that is also in English, so if for some reason those of you who are using the headsets today need me to replay the video, just let me know, okay? And we'll just do that and make sure that everybody is kind of on the same page. So as Jad mentioned to you, I'm a professor in the USA at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and my work largely centers on war reporting, especially in the 21st century and the present age. And also sort of more broadly, I look at international reporting, trying to understand the labor, the people who do the work, and the stories that they tell about the work they do. So I've changed the title of this talk a little bit from what's on the program, and that's partly because I think that gender as a term is a little bit more flexible than thinking just about women in war reporting. And so today I will be talking largely about female journalists who do this work. But I also want to think, as we did with our lecture on gender yesterday, about masculinity as well, and the difficulties that some male journalists face in performing those masculine expectations, especially in these extreme spaces of war. Now, this research is coming partly from a book that I've recently published with the University of Illinois Press, and that book is called Becoming the Story, War Correspondent Since 9/11. This book looks at the labor of war reporting in the context of the so-called war on terror, and I want to flag right from the start that the book's really critical of especially Western and most especially U.S. narratives surrounding these very diverse conflicts that have complicated contexts and histories that often get left out of Western war coverage. In the process of doing this research, I conducted qualitative, in-depth interviews with more than 100 correspondents and news editors. But I also went on to start a second book that I'm finishing up now that's coming out with Oxford University Press in 2019. And that book is looking, as I think Jad also mentioned, at the labor of locally based translators, interpreters, stringers, and fixers who work with correspondents from all over the world. The key is just that these correspondents don't know their way around, so they hire these important people to help them do their job. And that book focuses more on the perspectives of the people who do the work of fixing, a vexed term, stringing, and locally based interpreting and translating. And then a little bit of the research is also coming from an article that I wrote with Jad and published with him in 2016, so I'll talk a little bit more about that when the time comes. So first of all, I want to think a little bit about why it is that we would dedicate an entire morning to talking about gender and war reporting in the first place. And what I'd like to do is play a video for you, and then I'm going to ask you, because I'm not a big fan of being the only one talking for an hour and a half, I'm going to sort of pose the question to the room, what in this video do you see that makes you think about the challenges that are explicitly gendered when we're thinking about conflict in general, but also about war reporting? And let me know if I need to play this video more than once. So just kind of to summarize, let's think together as we watch this video about the challenges associated with gender in war reporting, so we can answer this question, why this is even worth talking about in the first place.
It was around the time of the US presidential election. While the world was consumed with what was happening in the US,
I didn't understand what was happening.
I was frightened.
Breaking news, reports of airstrikes.
The death toll stands at 120. Shireen and I had become the only major outlet for the world to see what was happening. Never have I found myself in a situation where the war is all around me.
This was my first big story, the first time I'd been in that environment. If we don't tell the story, nobody else will.
We're clearly taking a lot of back roads to try to get to our hotel.
I'm going to take this.
So many of the things that we were experiencing professionally and personally were just taking their toll on us.
heart broke into pieces, and I was desperate at that point to go home.
I gotta brush my hair.
You think your hair is the most important thing right now in the middle of this conflict? The thing about journalism is that no 2 days are alike. Every day is different. You never know who you're gonna meet.
We want to die with you, not don't die. We want to die with you.
And you never know where you're gonna find yourself. And that is the addictive part of the job.
Okay, so just to sort of situate that a little bit, this was the trailer from a documentary that was made and has been out for a couple of years now about Al Jazeera's presence in Gaza during one of the conflicts that happened a few years ago. And the situation, as many of you will probably remember, is that Al Jazeera at this specific point in time, in 2008, I believe, was one of the only, if not the only, television news network actually already based there. This was one of the times in which the entry into the area had been closed. There were a few print journalists, or I guess we would call them print, we might call them text-based journalists today, who were present, and of course numerous local journalists who were stringers, fixers, and also just people working at news organizations based there. But this was one of the only television networks at this particular moment in time who was able to be present. So they made a documentary about this experience. And for Shireen Tadros, who was the woman there, who now no longer works for Al Jazeera, she moved on to work at Sky News. This was one of her very first assignments. And she was working with this veteran correspondent, Ayman Moyeldin, who now also does not work for Al Jazeera, works for NBC in the United States. Would anyone like me to play the video again before we talk about it a little bit? Yeah? Okay, so I'm going to play it one more time so that we can get a good translation.
It was around the time of the US presidential election. While the world was consumed with what was happening in the US,
I didn't understand what was happening.
I was frightened.
Breaking news, reports of airstrikes.
Death toll stands at 120. Shireen and I had become the only major outlet for the world to see what was happening. Never have I found myself in a situation where the war is all around me.
This was my first big story, the first time I'd been in that environment. If we don't tell the story, nobody else will.
We're clearly taking a lot of back roads to try to get to our hotel.
I'm going to take
So many of the things that we were experiencing professionally and personally were just taking their toll on us.
My heart broke into pieces, and I was desperate at that point to go home.
I gotta brush my hair.
You think your hair is the most important thing right now in the middle of this conflict? The thing about journalism is that no 2 days are alike. Every day is different. You never know who you're gonna meet.
We want to die with you, not don't die. We want to die with you.
And you never know where you're gonna find yourself. And that is the addictive part of the job.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, hopefully twice will work. Yeah. Oh, great. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about this question then. What are some of the issues that we see in terms of gender and war reporting just in this video alone? Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. When we talk about gender and war reporting, we have in mind women. First of all, women is the most important component of the society. As a mother, as a sister, and you see, responsible for the family. Another thing about sympathy and passion regarding women. And if they hide a story, this will appear in the body language, in her tears, in you see in the video, she said, "We will die with you." So that expresses sympathy, feelings with others, more than man who can control himself, you see?
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little bit behind in the case of trying to sort of catch up when some of you are speaking in Arabic, though you are speaking in English. I'm sorry. Yes, so first of all, the connection, I think, that we could see between the journalists and the women who said these things, who were quoted as saying, you know, we want to die with you. The presence in the middle of the war zone of women who are very much a part of what's happening. I think that's such an important point. The fact that, first of all, we need to talk about gender in war reporting because women have always been present at the site of war, though it's not something that might be so obvious from the way that war is represented in a lot of films and television shows. Thank you for that. What else? Yeah.
Yeah, apart from the gender sensitivity during reporting, but I'm gonna only talk about this video, that we have this stereotype that women and children are minority and they are only the victims. So we focus on, during reporting any conflict or a war, that they are the victims, they are the weak part of the conflict, and men are they have all the masculinity and the strength and all of that. And we never focused on that women can be part of that, or they can even report that. They cannot even be reporters during conflict, or someone strong that we can depend on during conflict. And for example, my colleague just said that we should, he talked about women as I'm not criticizing him for that, but the stereotype we built, we're building always. So he talked about women as the weak part of the conflict, and that we have to help them and to and feel sorry for them. I think we should feel sorry for all of us, and for men and women and children, and we should feel that all of them are also can be strong and be part of the defending themselves and defending their lands and all of that. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such an important point also, this representation and sort of historical understanding of particularly women as being weak, but in especially the context of war, everyone's vulnerable and everyone has to sort of make an effort in their own ways to be strong. And we kind of see that in this video, and this is something I'll talk about a little bit later, the different ways in which these two journalists handled their vulnerability is something that we'll talk about even a little bit later. But the point is that there's a way of thinking about the strength of women in war zones as well as the vulnerability. Thank you. What else? Yeah.
Regarding the video, I didn't actually find any difference. It didn't show like a unique representation for women or female reporters than male reporters. Both of them went there. They did an amazing job because they were the only ones who cared about this during the mania about the US presidential elections and everything. And they were represented as like up to responsibility, and the woman was like doing her very first big stories, and she was like, okay, fine with this. So maybe if we give them an equal chance to be there, women too can prove their ability to be war correspondents. But actually I hear that many and even for covering the conflicts or protests or everything in the local contexts, many newspapers and many media institutions don't allow women to go there. And even during the Egyptian Revolution, I wasn't allowed to go. I was working for like a big English newspaper at that time, and they didn't allow me to go to the Al Tahrir Square many times. And they like sent so many reporters and photojournalists, males, of course. So I think I didn't find any difference in the video. All of them are okay.
Thank you so much for that. This is so important, and it's something that's also going to come up in this talk today. This way of, you know, thinking also about the fact that in some ways there aren't differences, especially not in terms of the work itself and what women are capable of doing. So many of the female journalists who I've interviewed have said exactly what you just said, and in fact really didn't like talking about gender at all, didn't like talking about the concept of difference in any way, because they wanted to focus on the labor. And I don't think it's that they were necessarily saying that there aren't differences, but that in the process of doing the work, we can both do the work. And that it's important to be able to point this out because of this exact problem you're identifying, that female journalists have historically been barred from covering this kind of story. So that's extremely important. Thank you. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I think in this video, what we saw is that the importance of having a female reporter on ground, and it's important because the things that women might see or report might be from a different angle that a male reporter or another person who's not a female, I'm saying, may not see. The way they question, and sometimes female reporters, and this is something I've heard from colleagues in the field, they're sometimes allowed to get into places that men cannot get into. So there is actually a need, and if media agencies or media networks and news networks are not able to realize their importance till now, we're seeing a shift, of course. Then the reporting will not be very effective and very complete on what's happening on the ground.
Excellent, yeah, and this is another thing that comes up a lot in the interviews that I've conducted, and also in many other works of research that I've read about this. So I think this is such an important point as well, that there is this way of thinking about a different perspective that can be provided. And some female journalists and some feminists in general, I suppose, if they would so identify, don't necessarily like the idea of a uniquely female perspective. Some of my own colleagues in academia who identify as feminists may sort of become uncomfortable with that idea because they think about gender as being culturally and socially constructed. But I really see the point of, even if we were to go that path and think of gender as being culturally and socially constructed, that could still bring a different perspective, right? There could still be a different way of seeing culture and the social that's based in the place in which women are sort of positioned within society. So either way you think about it, there is the potential to see conflict with a different kind of eye and to bring stories into the mainstream and into the public eye that may not be heard. So thank you. How about one more from the back? I think someone has had his hand up back here for a while. Yeah. Thank you.
صباح الخير، شكرا. يعني أنا بعتقد إنه شيرين أظهرت تميز كبير وقدرة على أداء الواجب المهني الصحفي، وبالمقابل أظهرت الشعور الإنساني كامرأة جنبا إلى الرجل. أعتقد أنه يعني يمكن تميزت بأكثر من جانب الامرأة في هذه الصورة، وتحديدا شيرين أنا بعرفها شخصيا. شكرا.
So I'm really sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat that question. I just got this.
شكرا. أنا بعتقد أنه شيرين أظهرت يعني تميز كبير في أداء واجب المهنة الصحفية في هذا الواجب، في هذه المهمة، وأيضا بالمقابل أظهرت الشعور الإنساني عندما قالت يتقطع قلبي ألما. شكرا.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, I appreciate that and agree so much. I was able actually, as I'll get into, to speak to Shireen in an interview a few years after she did that work, and she had so much more to say about that experience and about how difficult it was, but how at the same time it was so important to her to bring her own emotions into this process, which is another thing that's kind of highly debatable, I think, in journalism, is what is the place of human emotions in that case. Thank you so much. So I think we've made so many important points here, and just to summarize what we've really already been talking about, one of the first reasons why we should be talking about gender and war reporting in general is because women have never been totally absent from the spaces of war. As we saw in this video, as we've seen in countless other situations, this is a space that has always been populated by women, either as victims, sometimes as perpetrators, and also most often as strong agents trying to survive and help their families survive. And it's also crucial to note that women have been covering war journalistically for at least as long as the modern definition of the war correspondent has existed. Now that definition is fairly young. Thinking about war journalism as a profession is only about 100 years old, but we see really from the beginning of human history, or at least the beginning of written language, different examples of women writing about their experiences in war zones. So really even more than 100 years, the women have already been doing this work. And we know from the information that we've been able to gather over the course of the 20th century that the number of female war reporters has increased based on the sort of modern ways of being able to count, to look back and historically count who's been present and which types of journalists have been able to do this work. We've seen a steady increase of women war reporters. That could partly be because we've seen an increase in foreign reporters in general, so that may not necessarily be something that means that women are joining these ranks in larger numbers, but we have seen perhaps more focus on female war reporters. And there are some reasons for this that might be productive, and perhaps also, unfortunately, the focus could be and has been argued to be more about gaining readership or viewership also. So this way of suddenly seeing the figure of the female war reporter as a kind of commodity that can bring in audiences. This is not necessarily the best reason to be focusing on war reporters, I would argue, but at least it does bring that female perspective into the public eye. But as we know, female war reporters face a number of challenges, so I'll talk a little bit about those challenges. And then what I want to do is not stop by talking about the vulnerabilities and the problems, though they exist, but I also want to talk about the ways in which female journalists are combating those problems. So there's always that interplay between the deep structures in society that limit our agency and then the agency of human beings. There's always that sort of back and forth. And I'm someone who likes to talk about the back and forth and not just one or the other. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about both. Now, this first challenge will come as no surprise because it's a challenge that plenty of male journalists face as well. Just the risk of injury, imprisonment, death, the attacks on journalists that we see happening more and more, with more and more impunity. And I'll share a story with you. This is Nazila Fathi, who I was able to interview. She worked in Iran for a long time as a fixer, a stringer, and a contract correspondent with Western news organizations, and especially the New York Times. But it wasn't until 2009, and when she was covering the Green Revolution, that she actually faced some of her most challenging threats. So she told me that the New York Times didn't want me to leave Tehran because I was the only person at that point on the ground. A lot of people had been kicked out. I felt I couldn't do anything. And then when my house and her family came under surveillance, I just told the New York Times I was not going to stay. I was completely stressed out by then. And so this is an interesting situation because even the male correspondents who were working with the New York Times, who were very famous, very sort of had all of this cultural capital, had swiftly fled the country. Okay, they weren't there. They had run away because journalists were being expelled from the area at that point in time. But the New York Times needed someone to be on the ground, and Nazila Fathi had always been their person on the ground. She was Iranian, she knew the country, and this was her home. So they pressured her to stay even when she was particularly in danger, and she was suffering in this case because of her family, who had now been placed in danger as well. because of the work that she had done. Now, I think one of the things that always ends up happening is that people talk about the families of female war reporters, and they talk about their children, perhaps, more than they would mention these things if they were talking about male war reporters. So this is one of those cases in which it's more about that kind of perspective on womanhood and the contradiction of the kind of feminine subject in the war zone in general. This is not to say that male war reporters also, or conflict correspondents in this case, covering an uprising that became militarized, this is not to say that men don't also think of their families in these situations, but this is something that gets foregrounded. What was interesting to me, though, in the process of doing this research and talking with Nazila was the fact that her own news organization was putting her in danger, was not caring about these especially gendered dangers that she faced with her family being placed under surveillance, and was pressuring her to stay at a time when she really needed to leave. So she ended up leaving the war zone, and within a year had been let go, had basically been told the New York Times no longer needed her services. Okay, so she essentially lost her job because of leaving and protecting herself. So this is the kind of environment in which people are working. Another challenge that female journalists face, I would say disproportionately to men, although men also face this, is the problem of harassment. So increasingly when we're thinking about harassment, we're thinking about the connection between physical spaces and the space on the internet, online spaces, which become very real and have real consequences for people who are being harassed in this sense. So there's a lot of research that's just been coming out on female journalists being harassed online or in the field, being subjected to sexual innuendo, not necessarily going into actual sexual assault, which we'll talk about a little more in a minute, but also some of those microaggressions, comments constantly on physical appearance when that's not the focus, that's not the reason why they're doing this work, unless, in fact, it's probably one of the last reasons they'd be doing it. Trolling on social media, which devolve into rape threats, and this is something that especially female journalists have been facing, so that they'll open up, and this is happening not just in conflict correspondence, but in all types of journalism, they'll open up those social media accounts that they are required now to be constantly updating, and they'll find just sometimes thousands and thousands of comments trying to sort of place them back in a submissive role and threatening them with rape. And the research that we've been seeing has been saying that the anonymity of the web has really been allowing people to feel confident doing this kind of thing. But it's important to note that female war reporters have faced this kind of thing for hundreds of years in person in the field itself. In the most extreme spaces, in militarized spaces, anonymity doesn't seem to be quite as necessary. This is something that is a constant threat for especially, not only, but especially women in the field. And that leads me to this very complicated discussion of sexual assault. So many of you have probably seen at least some of the discussion that happened in 2011 around the figure of Lara Logan, who was in Tahrir Square, just the very night, in fact, of Mubarak's resignation. And then this is also Lindsay Adaria, who in 2011 was in Libya and faced sexual assault when she was kidnapped. So this is an interesting case, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, first to think about that danger that women do face disproportionately to men, of being sexually assaulted, actually raped in the process of doing this work. However, I think it's also really important to note that so often the focus tends to be on women coming, the kind of international focus tends to be on women who are coming from, these Western backgrounds. So there was this huge focus in not just English language media, but Western media, I guess I could say, on Lara Logan after this event happened to her. And almost no focus on the numerous women who were also facing this danger in Tahrir Square, who were Egyptian, who were coming from contexts outside the West, local journalists, protesters. and also not much focus on the female activists who actually got Lara Logan out of Tahrir Square, who are the ones who saved her. So to think again about that situation of women's strength, not just their vulnerability, but their strength. So often when we talk about this particular challenge, the challenge of sexual assault, we kind of, unfortunately, slip back into that habit, I would argue, of pathologizing women, of pointing out their vulnerabilities in a way that editors themselves will take up as a justification for not sending female journalists into the field. Which is why so many people, so many female journalists were angry when Lara Logan sort of came out and spoke about her experience, some of them because they felt that she was making it harder for them to work, and others because they felt that she was making this all about white Western women, when in fact it was not. And this was a really important point that got lost in a lot of the Western coverage. So this is something that I would love for us to talk about a little bit more in the Q&A, the complexity, the importance of being really careful. Obviously, when we're thinking about some of these threats, are there women who are facing these threats who are not even getting any sort of recognition for this? Are we just also sort of engaging in this pathologization of women in rendering them too vulnerable and not thinking about their strength as well? And one of the reasons I think that a lot of times women are thought of as being vulnerable is because of these cultural narratives about emotion, about the kind of legend that women are more in touch with their feelings, perhaps more susceptible to emotional strain. And I think that's why it is very brave when female journalists talk about the emotional strain that they experience in the field. But I'll come back to this later also to talk about the strain that men feel as well. So when I interviewed Shireen Tadros, who was the woman who was in the video that we were talking about earlier, she went into a lot more detail because she had several years between that moment that you saw in the video and the moment when we were sitting together in Doha just talking about this situation. And so she felt comfortable telling me that this was an incredibly difficult assignment emotionally for her. And this is what she said. She said, "I remember afterwards I had to go through this therapy when I came back after the war in Gaza. And I had all sorts of issues with people around me because I found that Ayman, during the time in Gaza, was shouting at me a lot and sort of telling me off for being scared. I'd made the realization from being on the ground so much that I could really well, at the very least, have a leg blown off if this war continues. So I was sort of in that mind frame of, I'm not invincible. Something's going to happen to me. I'm going to die." So she, I think in this situation it was really interesting. There are a few things we can kind of unpack here. First of all, she's not afraid, at least all of these years later. Things are sometimes much easier in retrospect. She's not afraid to say, I was in the war zone doing this work and I was terrified of dying or of being injured. And I knew that this was absolutely possible. There was no wall between me. We talk about that kind of strange wall that comes up. Photographers especially talk about this when they're looking through the lens and somehow they just do the work, focus on the work, and then they don't feel as vulnerable. Some photographers have also told me that that's really a problem of younger photographers who perhaps have not yet really learned just how in danger they are. But for Shireen, this was something that was kind of around her all the time, and she noticed that her own reactions, her own emotional strain in the field actually caused her partner, Ayman Mohyeldin, to react in a very specifically emotional way as well, that he was sort of yelling at her. And she had to go to therapy, something that is still socially stigmatized all over the world, in order to work through these problems. And I've spoken to numerous journalists who have said, all the way on the spectrum from needing a couple of trips to a therapist to full-blown PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that this is a huge danger of doing this kind of work for journalists, some of whom may get this, as a kind of secondary experience just by watching the trauma of others, and some of whom are very traumatized themselves just from the experiences that they face. So talking about emotions, how can we think about emotion as a danger that women face, but that they also might be willing to put more of a name to because of the fact that it's such a taboo subject for male journalists? Is there a way in which women journalists have been able to start talking about the emotional strain a little bit more? That's debatable, and it's another thing we could discuss in the Q&A. So now what I'd like to do, I mean, there are numerous other challenges as well, but I want to get into the question of agency. What are the strategies? What are the different choices that female journalists especially make in the process of trying to handle these challenges? And to talk about that, I'm going to be using some of the material from the article that Jad and I did together in 2016. And we came up with this idea of shape-shifting. Okay, and I'll talk about what that means. And again, this is something that I'd be really interested to get your feedback on in the Q&A. And so I'm defining shape-shifting this way, as a process through which female journalists draw upon a variety of gendered performances that help them effectively orient themselves to the unique circumstances that they face. So I'm talking about gendered performances in the sense of how do we every day as human beings perform the expectations that society gives us, but do we always perform the exact same expectations? Probably not. All of us engage in shape-shifting at one point or another. In different academic fields, it's been called code shifting, right? So it's this kind of way of thinking about, especially in linguistics, how do you code shift? How do you use different dialects to relate more to different types of people? But the most important thing to understand, and anyone who's worked as a journalist here probably already knows this, is that when we're talking about performances, we're not talking about lying or being dishonest or being something that you're not. We're talking about engaging with expectations that are already being imposed on you anyway, and that you've probably already performed before, okay? So this is part of your identity. These performances, this shape-shifting, is dependent on the environment around you. So it's contingent on what it is that's happening to you in the moment, okay? And it's also directly tied to issues of safety. So female war reporters especially have to do this work in order to keep safe, but also in order to get the stories that they need to get in order to continue doing the work that they want to do and being able to live, because this is their profession. They need to be able to live. So I'm going to talk about 3 different types of shape-shifting today, and there are probably more. This is not exhaustive. The first type is bracketing difference. We talked about this a little bit already. Setting aside the notion of gendered differences and emphasizing the sameness that women have with men, okay? So some people might argue that this is actually performing a masculine sort of role in the war zone, and some of our interviewees actually said that. And others would say that this is performing, this is a way of kind of performatively hiding or de-emphasizing difference in the war zone. So I'll give you a few examples. This is a quote by Kate Adie from the BBC, and she told me, "You don't not go, and you don't have people telling you we won't send a woman. You just don't accept that. You merely say, we will go in, and I will make sure I have as much ability to report as anyone else." And for Kate Adie, who has been doing this kind of work for many, many decades, in the context of the British, BBC, she said that it was this sort of constant battle that also had to not look like a battle, right? So it had to look like, I am just doing the same thing you are. I'm not even emphasizing that I'm a woman, but yet I'm fighting all the time to be seen as the same as you are. And so it was put a little bit differently by a woman who wished to remain anonymous, who I interviewed, who said, "I've always tried to be serious and assertive. You get just those first few seconds of a very first impression to assert yourself and prove yourself." And she went on to kind of explain that that seriousness and assertiveness was, in a way, a strategy through which she dealt with especially sexism in the war zone, coming from her own colleagues as well as from people on the ground, sources. If she acted assertive and serious and did not sort of play this role that might have been expected of her, this more gentle, taking this more gentle approach, then she was able in those first couple of moments to get the respect she needed in order to finish the job. But she saw this as a kind of performance of gender that had to do with those masculine expectations. So there were many more women who said things like what we've already discussed, that you just do the same work, there doesn't have to be any kind of difference. There were also women, and some of this was coming from the interviews that Jad conducted, who said that essentially, you know, they were working, especially in the context of Lebanon, they had cameramen who would not necessarily do what the women told them, right? So the female journalists were giving instructions to their cameramen who would not take instructions necessarily from women until these female journalists had to become very assertive. Perhaps we might even call it aggressive, right? They had to just say, this is what I want, I'm showing you, this is my job, and this is your job. We have to get this job done. And in some contexts, this kind of behavior would be seen as being more masculine, but it would also be seen as a way of bracketing some of these other differences. This issue of bracketing difference is really messy because some people would say this has nothing to do with gender at all. It just has to do with the way of doing the work. Others would say it's a particular type of engagement with gendered expectations that may or may not be correct. So we can talk about that together. The next strategy is another strategy that's already come up in our discussion today, and that's this issue of establishing camaraderie that very much has to do with accentuating the fact that you are a woman. So this is actually a picture of Lindsay Hilsum, who we'll hear from in just a moment. She's with Channel 4 in the UK, and you know, the issue here is finding common ground, especially between women. So being able to get interviews with women, talking woman to woman about topics that perhaps male journalists wouldn't be able to discuss. And this is one of the interviews that Jad conducted, and this is coming from Aliyah Ibrahim from Al Arabiya. She said, when a crew includes a woman, access becomes easier for everyone, including the men. The homes we entered and the families we had dinner with and slept in their rooms would have never allowed the men on my team to enter if not for me as a woman being with them. It somehow became appropriate to allow young single men into a house and into a family because they were accompanied by a woman. So the very presence of this female journalist made this kind of access to these sources much more possible, simply because of these social norms that had to do with the presence of women in general, okay? And then Lindsay Hilsum from Channel 4 News, sort of in a different kind of way, told me that as a woman, I can talk to everybody. I can talk to the men, but I can also talk to the soldiers. I can talk to the president, and she mentioned that she can talk to the women as well. There was this way that she kind of mentioned of changing your tone, of changing your mode of address depending upon which type of sources you were trying to engage. And especially, she said, and many other interviewees said, when you're trying to get interviews with soldiers or with police, there is a way in which they appear to be less threatened by women, and because of that, perhaps they'll talk to them more. And so there's this kind of debate amongst a lot of the women I interviewed, you know, is this ethical to sort of accentuate the more feminine side, the sort of softer side, perhaps, to accentuate the fact that, or at least to pretend that you're not any sort of threat in one moment, and then in another moment to go in and take that aggressive mode? Is this an ethical thing? I don't actually have an answer for that, and I would be excited to hear what you all think, especially those of you who've been practicing as journalists yourself. But suffice it to say, this is a strategy that is in place and is being used constantly in order to get the story. And then last of all, we talked a little bit in this article about accentuating vulnerability. So this is like establishing camaraderie, but it's going a step further and really accentuating the belief that women are weak, and because of that, they need special assistance, okay? So letting that kind of attitude stand in order to get through a situation that might be dangerous or to get the information that is needed. So an anonymous field producer for Al Jazeera told me when she was trying to get through a checkpoint or through the airport in Cairo, she said, I managed to get through the airport with 2 really big wheelie bags. I put on a dress, put on some makeup, and I had 3 flak jackets, an A1 camera, a BGAN, and some cables and some discs. And I just rolled them straight through the Cairo airport at a time when this was not easy to do, because you don't look like a journalist. You look like a woman. And so this was an interesting thing. I mean, for her to look like a woman and not a journalist was to put on a dress, to put on makeup, to really kind of make her physical appearance softer, less threatening. And because of this, she believes she was able to get through the checkpoint. That's, one of the interesting things about conducting interviews, as you know, many of you as journalists, is that we don't always know if the reason someone identifies for their success is actually the reason, right? There could have been some other reasons as well. There might be some assumptions going into this particular person's testimony, and there might not be, but it is what she believes helped her to get through the checkpoint. Here's another story, again coming from the interviews that Jad conducted by Aliyah Ibrahim. When they spotted us from a distance, they started shooting at us. Then they rushed in towards us, and at first were extremely aggressive and threatening, pushing the guys around and yelling at them with a lot of anger. They were very violent with my male crew members, but when they noticed that I was pregnant, they suddenly became very mellow and accommodating. In this circumstance, the guys used me and my pregnancy for protection. So taking on the shape and really allowing the shape of the pregnant woman, right? This kind of quintessentially vulnerable, again, this is a social kind of understanding of pregnancy. This vulnerable shape, allowing that shape to sort of stand and be visible as such, really perhaps saved the lives of not only this woman, but also her crew. So this, I felt, was one of the more fascinating testimonies that we had in this particular study. The very presence of a pregnant woman in the war zone is already sort of paradoxical and contradictory, but the ability to use it and to use her own sort of vulnerability there to get through this situation, I think, is incredibly resourceful and something that we need to know more about. So accentuating vulnerability and able to get through dangerous situations, and also to be able to get the material that you need for the story. These are 3 strategies, and I just want to foreground again, this doesn't mean the fact that women can do these particular things in order to help them achieve their goals. It doesn't mean that they're suddenly working outside of society, or that they're, completely free from all of the deep structures that are in place, limiting their agency. But we need to be able to look at both the challenges and the ways in which people are so resourceful, the ways in which they kind of fight back. And so to summarize this, because I want, before we turn it out for questions, I want to also talk a little bit about masculinity. But, we need to think about the fact that there are explicitly gendered obstacles that women face in the war zone. But we also need to think about the fact that women are incredibly strong and resourceful, even if they are also vulnerable in certain ways. So avoiding victimization, I would argue, is really important in this type of work, but so is taking a stand and criticizing the structures that are in place that limit female journalists to begin with. And I want to now kind of zoom out on this and say that this holds true for all international reporters who face danger in the field. And this is the reason why I want to think about gender a little bit more generally now, because male war reporters also face gendered challenges. There's even more of a taboo about sexual assault in the field when you're talking about men. But unfortunately, as I think we know, male journalists have also been sexually assaulted in the field, and this is one of them. This is Stephen Farrell. I showed you a picture of Lindsay earlier, who had been sexually assaulted in Libya. If you read her testimony, her book that was about that experience, and if you read some of the interviews that came out with her afterwards, she talks about how her colleague Stephen was also assaulted right alongside her, and it was very clear that that assault was of a sexual nature. But for some reason, even after this was in her book, in the interviews she gave, in the interviews that Stephen gave, he spoke about this himself, there was much less focus on this fact than there was on her assault. I think that's really interesting. What is it about this focus on this as a danger that women face? Why is this only happening in conversation surrounding women? This is also a danger that men face. Perhaps not as much, okay? The sort of level of danger might be disproportionate, but it does happen, and it's something worth talking about. there are all kinds of other challenges. So this sort of macho performance in the field is much more of an expectation, perhaps, for male journalists than it is for female journalists, though that even is something that's probably debatable. And that kind of legend of the intrepid, war hero is difficult to rewrite. This is an image of Sebastian Junger, who's a war reporter and documentarian. He produced the documentary Restrepo, and also a documentary that came out much more recently about the death of Tim Hetherington in Libya. And I interviewed him, it's been a while now, probably in 2013, and he told me something really interesting, something very direct about gender. Junger said that he intentionally chose to start reporting in the conflict zone because up until that point, and this is him, I'm quoting him, I didn't feel like a man. He hadn't yet faced the adversity that, as he says, any young man needs to face in order to be fully formed. And so he kind of went on to talk about this in really self-evident sort of terms, like he didn't seem uncomfortable just sort of calling this out as it was. He just said, this was sort of my baptism into, becoming, like moving from being a boy to a man, just going into a war zone and facing adversity. Now, that was interesting to me because Junger grew up in a privileged suburb in the United States, right? He grew up in a certain environment where he was privileged not to have faced adversity his entire life. And for him to go seek out masculinity, by traveling somewhere else betrays a certain kind of white Western privilege that I think we need to really be careful about and critique. There are plenty of people who have grown up in environments that they did not choose. So it's interesting that he said later, when he went to Afghanistan, he found it to be a physically intimidating environment. And he got unbelievably sick, a severe case of dysentery, and quite a bit of the assignment he did while running a really high fever. So his sort of image of himself as going into these places and becoming a man ended up sort of crumbling once he got there and realized that this is not an easy place for anyone to work, let alone women. This is a hard place to work, and it's a hard place to maintain that performance of masculinity that's been so long associated with the war zone. So crucially, and Junger was kind of hinting at this, men are also not immune from emotional strain. And this is something that's just recently finally being addressed a little bit more overtly. We're seeing programs now in different newsrooms for any sort of person facing emotional strain, especially PTSD. But it's a slow process. It takes a really long time to institutionalize these types of programs to help people sort of work through the things they've seen. But we know from some of the research that is being done that post-traumatic stress disorder is a major problem for both men and women war reporters, and so are the more subtle types of emotional trauma that aren't necessarily diagnosable, but that just haunt these people after the work that they've done. And being a veteran journalist like Ayman Mohyeldin in the video we saw earlier in no way exempts you from this problem. Numerous people with whom I've spoken have said they've been to conflict after conflict, and it's just suddenly something that will snap. Suddenly, a good example is Michael Holmes with CNN. He was in Iraq, he had done all of this work for decades, and then suddenly when he returned from Iraq in 2004, he couldn't drive down the interstate without panicking and without thinking that every car around him might be carrying a bomb. This isn't necessarily full-blown PTSD, but it's a kind of emotional strain. So we saw in the video earlier that there was this kind of bravery coming from Shireen, and also in the interview that she did with me in talking about emotional strain, but she also said that it was a lot harder for Ayman Mohyeldin to discuss this. So coming back to that quote from her from earlier, she said, I found that Ayman was shouting at me a lot and sort of telling me off for being scared. And my therapist described it as a coping mechanism, and everybody has a mechanism. And the therapist was telling me that for Ayman, he needed to believe that he was invincible, and I was disturbing his coping mechanism, because I was having the impact of reality on him, whereas he needed to believe that everything was going to be okay. But my therapist said, you have to move on and forgive him because you were really disturbing him. You crying, especially because you were friends, it really disturbed him and he couldn't cope anymore. So this is an interesting perspective. It's important to note that this is, kind of secondhand. This is Shireen Tadros' perspective and her therapist's perspective. I was never able to interview Ayman Mohyeldin because he had moved to NBC, and right at the time that he moved to NBC, everyone who worked with NBC had been forbidden from giving any kind of interview because of a scandal that was happening at the time. So I don't know what his perspective on this would be, and I think we need to keep in mind that he may have a different perspective. But it is interesting to think about this kind of shouting as an expression of emotional strain, even though it's coming out in a different way. This veteran male war reporter shouting because just the kind of image of someone else coping differently is kind of poking holes in his notion of reality. So this is something that affects everyone, and I kind of want to leave today with just something that I think we can probably agree on, which is the fact that all war reporters face an intense physical and psychological level of danger, and there have only recently been sufficient initiatives to counter this problem. We've had this United Nations plan of action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. What that's really achieved is probably extremely debatable. If nothing else, it's brought some visibility to the problem. But as I have spoken with Joel Simon of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and he's said, the issue is, first of all, accountability. It's really hard to get different governments and different news organizations to actually hold themselves accountable for allowing journalists to do the work they need to do. And it's also difficult because there's so many different kinds of news organizations in the world. Not every news organization is an Al Jazeera, right, or an Al Arabiya. There are many different levels of outlets. There are freelancers, there are people who are working for small local stations, but all of these different expressions are important. And so the key really is that all journalists, male or female, across all media, need to be able to do their jobs. And the reason for this is because when it's safe to speak, the whole world benefits. This is a quote from, at that time, the UN Deputy Secretary General, coming from that sort of moment when the United Nations was thinking about this plan of action. But I hope that we can talk a little bit now in the time that we have left, which it looks like we have plenty, about whether or not we agree, first of all, with everything we've heard here, and then also what are some of the other strategies, perhaps, that both men and women can enact when they're trying to do this important work. Thank you. So let's do Q&A. We've got a lot of time. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for this interesting presentation because I'm super interested in this topic in particular. I have like 3 quick comments regarding what you have presented. Actually, you didn't bring, I know this because of course, of the limitation of time, you didn't bring something about African McRakers and African correspondents, because the case in Ghana, for example, is completely different. I was like interviewing Professor Anya Schifrin, the amazing professor and journalist from Columbia University, and she had like her newest book, 75 years of African McRaking. And in the book, she was deeply studying the history of investigative journalism and war correspondence in Africa. And it was very, very, very rare to find a female African McRaker who could do something for her country, although like all the topics and the chapters of the book included many aspects related to mining, related to corruption, gender issues, and everything. And it was like one example of a female journalist who went to cover the genocide in Rwanda. And actually she didn't get the approval very easily from her boss or her editor-in-chief. So the case in Africa is even worse. Wow. These examples are like even brighter, and but other parts of the world you won't find this conception of sending a female correspondent to the conflict land or something like this available. Secondly, I had like a recent interview with Steve Forbes, the chairman of Forbes magazine, of course, and the guy was like shedding lights on the importance of integrating the personal point of view in the stories. He was saying, okay, everyone is covering the same news, and now we are losing, all of us as media industries are losing people's interest. Mm-hmm. What we can do now is to reflect on our understanding and analysis and integrate this into the stories. People are searching for something unique to find in the stories. And in this context, I find like enabling women to integrate into this industry of like covering conflicts and being correspondents is even more important, because as my colleague was like highlighting, they can bring different aspects to the story, and they can even have more, even the emotional strain that you were like highlighting, it's not a challenge, it's more like an opportunity, because it will engage people more to their stories, especially if they are visual. Thirdly, the photojournalists and the video journalists, especially in the war fields, 99, please correct me if I'm mistaken, 99% of them are males, because I've never found any female conflict or war video journalist that was a woman. I didn't see this, although I've been like working in this field for 7 years now. I know this is not like a history or something with anyways, because I moved to many like media institutions. So these are like my 3 comments. Thank you. I want to know your opinion about them, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that you're making so many crucial points. I mean, there are a vast number of differences in the cultures of war reporting depending on the sort of socio-cultural and geopolitical contexts. So there are different traditions of who might have gained access to the field and who might have not. And I think that's really, really important to note. I agree with you completely on that. In terms of the issue of the personal and bringing the personal into journalism, I think that this focus perhaps on keeping the personal out, objectivity as a term that's incredibly vexed, as we know. I mean, that's also coming from particular cultural contexts. And there, as we know, are traditions of journalistic reporting that have never been necessarily so fascinated with the notion of objectivity, but have been more interested in the idea of taking certain perspectives, championing them, serving as advocates. So in some contexts, that's not necessarily ever been particularly important. And I think we're seeing in the United States a move, we've been seeing a move toward that type of journalism really since the 1960s. But especially lately because of this feeling that so much is suddenly at stake. There's this very narcissistic kind of discussion happening in the United States right now that has to do with this inward-looking attitude about so much now being at stake, as if it hasn't always been at stake, and as if there haven't always been so many challenges. So in a way, I feel like perhaps the United States is only just catching up to this idea that it's very difficult to remain objective on, at least in journalism, on some of these questions. Others would argue that U.S. journalism has never been objective, that has always had a very particular perspective and one that might need to be critiqued intensely. And then for your third point, yes, I think that I also found it incredibly rare in my research for women to be photographers and videographers. And some of them told me that because historically the video cameras were so heavy that the smaller female frame, I don't know if this was the justification coming from men or if women agreed, but the smaller female frame made it more difficult to hold the camera. This, of course, is not the case now. I did meet one female videographer who worked for CNN, worked in Egypt actually, but she was the only person. So I think that's really, really interesting and probably needs further research. Thank you.
Sorry.
I'll let you sort of direct it because I can't see where the microphone's.
I'm here. I already have the mic. Can I speak?
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to ask you, if a female journalist chooses not to go to a war zone, her TV station or whatever newspaper is going to deal with her as a man who refused to go. Does she have the advantages is that she's a woman and she can choose if she wants to go or not?
Well, I think that again might come back to which type of newsroom this is. Thank you for your question. And sort of what cultural context we're working in. So it sounds like there are places where that really is not an advantage and the choice is not hers. In other cases, I think that for some women, if they've been fighting for a long time and have made the case, especially that they're no different, that they can do the same work, then they have the opportunity to go. But it seems to come at this high price of constantly making this case that they're the same, at least to their editors, and having to hide things that might be associated with feminine difference. A number of women I spoke to said, especially if they chose to get pregnant, for example, they would find themselves quickly losing assignments. The kind of confidence in them as just employees in general would begin to decline. When Lara Logan got pregnant, one of her news directors actually blamed the slide in ratings of CBS News in the US on her pregnancy and blamed it, the entire station's ratings, right? The entire sort of news network's ratings supposedly went down because Lara Logan got pregnant. So it's very difficult. I mean, it's again that constant interplay between these structures that limit us and the resourcefulness that we kind of fight back with. I think that's an important question to ask. Thank you. Okay, sure.
سؤال بشكل عام حول الجندرية وخاصة في مجتمعات دول العالم الثالث. لازلنا في مجتمعات دول العالم الثالث نعاني من موضوع تمكين المرأة سواء كان سياسيا أو اقتصاديا أو اجتماعيا، وبالتالي دورها في المجتمع بغض النظر عن المهنة التي تقوم فيها. هنالك معوقات كثيرة قد تكون اجتماعية بسبب أو ثقافية بسبب طبيعة المجتمع ونظرة الدونية للمرأة والصورة النمطية للمرأة في هذه المجتمعات، وقد تكون أحيانا سياسية من خلال التشريعات اللي موجودة في البلد، وبالتالي يعني تميز ما بين المرأة وما بين الرجل في احتلال بعض المناصب في مهنة معينة. إلا أنه في الدول الغربية لا أعتقد بأن المجتمع يعني له نظرة يعني أتوقع بأن هنالك نظرة مختلفة للمرأة، وبالتالي ليس لديها مشكلة في القيام بأي عمل. فمثلا هي تقوم بمعظم المهن سواء كانت طبيبة، مهندسة، صحفية، قيادية في المجتمعات، لكن هذه يعني أرى بأن هنالك قد يكون معوق وحيد، وهو معوقات شخصية تعود على المرأة نفسها. وبالتالي كما تكلمتي مثلا بعض الخصائص الفسيولوجية للمرأة، بعض مثلا هذه يعني الأمور الخاصة التي تعود عليها، وبالتالي لا نتكلم عن جندرية بل نتكلم عن الجنس اللي هو يعني الفرق بين الذكر والأنثى من الناحية البيولوجية. لذلك هذا الأمر يعني طبيعي جدا، وليس يعني طبيعي جدا في التعامل ما بين أو في التفريق ما بين الذكر والأنثى.
Thank you very much for that comment. So it's very interesting. I mean, I am not sure if I can speak confidently to the comparison that seems to be being made between the West and perhaps some other contexts of operation. I do know that women in the West, if we're talking about first of all, the West, I guess, is also a pretty broad term, you know. If we're talking about women in the context of the United States, there are obstacles still that are political and that are sort of social and cultural and that have to do with attitudes toward just the capability of women, and are they really able to be as good at what they do as men? Those kinds of things certainly are still present and still remain. They have not, at least in the last maybe 40 or 50 years especially, been able to keep women out of this profession in such great numbers as perhaps like the context that the young woman here in the front was talking about earlier on the African continent. So it seems like there are some differences there still that I think that you're pointing out. There has been some discussion about whether issues such as pregnancy, physical differences, all of those things are really only personal, or whether or not these things that can be viewed as personal are also very much political in a way. And so it may be a matter of how we're kind of defining the personal. Perhaps we're kind of thinking differently about what the personal means and how it comes to reflect itself in society. And in that case, I would say that even something as personal as the body becomes highly political in a number of ways. And I think we kind of talked about that some yesterday in the lecture about gender and commodification. All of those things that impact women kind of filter down into individual people's ability to access certain structures or do certain kinds of work. That's what I would argue. But I think I see what you're saying, and I appreciate your perspective. I hope that is an adequate response. Thank you very much. Who else?
Okay.
Okay.
هل يخضع مراسلو الحرب إلى تأهيل نفسي قبل ذهابهم إلى جبهات القتال؟ وهل يكون هناك جرعات أكبر لزميلاتنا من الصحفيات المراسلات الحرب في هذا الجانب؟ شكرا.
Thank you very much. Yeah, from what I understand, women war reporters don't necessarily get better treatment. I think that perhaps some of them might be a little bit more comfortable. This is highly debatable. Some of the women I've spoken with have said that women feel more comfortable seeking that kind of treatment. Other women, though, have said that that's actually not the case, that they are less comfortable seeking psychological treatment because it will further accentuate their vulnerability. I have never heard of any war reporters getting therapy in any systematic or institutionalized way before going into the war zone. And I think that is a fascinating idea and probably should happen. But we're so far from having that kind of care institutionalized. Thank you. Uh-oh. So are we still? So I think there's time for a few more questions. I just can't see, but just okay. There we go.
Yes, I want to thank Mr. Dr. Jad Melki.
Okay.
Thank you. I watch on Future Television Mr. Jad Melki. Want to thank you and all the Lebanese American university community. Simple words about changing tones. You mentioned about changing tones. I want to say, and I'm sorry. And the water kept rising, first the valleys, then the hills, and finally the very tallest mountains from Lebanon and to all the Milky Way. This is for how, considering media from Lebanon, Future Television, I remember Diana Mkhalid, or Diana Mkhalid. No. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if you could repeat that. I'm really sorry. Oh. I want to make sure to hear what you're saying. I'm just a little...
I was thanking Mr. Dr. Jad Melki here. I was watching him on Future Television. Future in television for established by Prime Minister Martin Rafiq al-Hariri in 90s.
What's it?
Listen.
I'm so sorry. Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Who else would like to say something? Okay.
في مشكلة في الترجمة إجمالا على الجهاز. أنا أود أن أسأل عن الأطفال. ورد في التقرير الأول برومو تصوير للأطفال وهو متعلق بعمل المراسل. هذه إشكالية جدلية كبيرة في تصوير الأطفال بإذن أو من غير إذن. يعني قد يطبع على الأطفال سمة أو وسم، وفي نفس الوقت مهم إظهار الصورة أو الحالة التي يتعرضون لها. ما هي المعايير التي تعتمدونها عند تصوير الأطفال؟
So, I wonder if someone would be willing to tell me. Nobody was translating that. Okay. Okay. Okay, it was because of the power. Sorry. Could you repeat the question?
مرة أخرى، ما هي المعايير التي تعتمدونها عند تصوير الأطفال في الحروب؟ لأن هذا الموضوع جدلي جدا يعني.
What kind of standards you take into consideration when taking photos for kids during wars?
Okay, so thinking about the presence of children in war times as being a controversial issue. Okay. I appreciate that, and I apologize here for the delays, and this is an interesting experience. Yeah, I think that especially, thinking about media ethics and how it is that we go and we cover these types of stories, this is a big question in multiple perspectives, but certainly coming from journalists working in the West, is how to sort of think about the dangers that children face, but also how to represent these dangers in a way that doesn't endanger them more. And it's something that I have noticed a lot of female journalists have especially kind of taken up as their own cause. Again, debatable, some women wouldn't necessarily want that to be what they focus on. They would want to focus on frontline journalism and covering that specific type of conflict. But I agree that this is a really important issue that is probably too difficult to take a stance on at this point. It's just one of the great messy realities of covering war. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I hope that was an adequate response. How much more time do we have? Maybe a few more? Oh, great, 5 minutes, okay.
Okay, so while studying journalism, so we were taught that you have to be neutral, and while reporting, especially conflicts and wars, you have to be so professional and not to get involved inside the conflict. But I don't know whether that's ethical or not. If I'm reporting something and I see that a child or like I'm talking as a woman, a reporter woman. Mm-hmm. So if I'm seeing a child or someone and I can help, and I'm there during the conflict and I'm reporting that. So whether to stick with what I've studied in journalism, just being neutral and stand there and report and film what's happening and just leave them to die or whatever, and that's only my job, or to help and to get involved in that if I have something to do. Mm-hmm. So I'm really confused about that throughout my studies about the reporting conflicts, and I always have this question. So I want to hear your opinion about that.
Thank you. This is one of the maybe, well, I wouldn't say age-old questions, because again, the idea of not being involved, I think is really determined by the culture in which journalism is being taught. But I can say that in sort of Anglophone, especially U.S. journalism, there's been a lot of discussion about conflict reporting as the kind of limit case of this idea of neutrality and of not being involved. And there's kind of, often when this question is asked, people will invoke this journalist, Kevin Carter, who went to Africa in the 1990s and took this really famous picture of a starving child, sort of crawling along with a vulture. You're familiar with the picture. And part of this discussion is how he received a great deal of criticism after that for not doing something, for not picking up that child and taking the child to help. And he did commit suicide, actually, as many people know, not terribly long after that. And many of his colleagues thought that maybe the stress of that situation was part of it. So it's an incredibly difficult question, because if your job is to show something that's happening, and the argument is that you have to focus on your job so that more people will see, then there's some merit to that. But so many, especially I mean, both men and women who I've interviewed for this work have said that this is perhaps the source of some of the greatest emotional strain, is that kind of decision. Do you help? Do you not? Are there moments where it's really more about being a human being? It's more about that humanity. And people have made totally different decisions. So there's no answer, I don't think. I think that people sort of take this on a case-by-case basis and make decisions. I personally don't really believe much in objectivity, so that's just my perspective. I think you can report something in as fair a way as possible, but at the end of the day, I think that we're people, and that helping each other is probably important too, and there are different ways to do that. So, no easy answer. Sorry, it's a great question. Maybe time for one more. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
صباح الخير.
Good morning.
في البداية أشكرك على هذه المحاضرة القيمة، حقيقة استمتعنا بها. لفت نظري حديث تفضلت به زميلتي، وعبارة قالتها إنه المرأة قادرة على الدفاع عن وطنها. حقيقة هذا شيء رائع ونحن نؤمن به جدا، لكن سأتحدث عن تجربة شخصية بخصوص مشاركة المرأة في تغطية المظاهرات والأحداث التي تجري. عندما كنا نخرج ضد الحكومات في أثناء ثورات الربيع العربي، كنا نخرج في بعض الأحيان ونصادف وجود مراسلات خاصة من الصحافة الأجنبية، وكان هناك يلتف حولهن مجموعة من الأشخاص الغير مسؤولين أو الفوضويين. لهذا كنا نضطر نحن قادة المظاهرات أو قادة المطالبات أن نخرج عن مطالبتنا الرئيسية ونلتفت لهؤلاء المراسلات كي نحميهن وكي نحافظ عليهن من الاعتداء، سواء الاعتداء أو التحرش الجنسي أو الاعتداء البدني. لهذا أوافق يعني على قدرة المرأة وعلى وظيفة المرأة وعلى إمكانية أن تقوم المرأة بتغطية الأحداث، ممكن حتى أفضل من الرجل. لكن بخصوص هذه الناحية أعتقد أنه في هذه الأوقات أو في هذه الأثناء محتاجة إلى رجل أكثر من محتاجة إلى امرأة، نظرا لهذه الناحية فقط وليس إلى أي اعتبار آخر. وشكرا.
Thank you for your comment, and I think that's something that's very much at the heart of what's at stake in sort of discussing and debating these topics. And I think that it's so wonderful to hear that people are standing up for women in these situations when they see this happening. So I think that certainly the presence of men, male activists, male journalists, it continues to be crucial, and that we would never want to see a shift, right, where there were only suddenly female journalists, because then we'd also lose these other perspectives as well, and we would sort of have to deal with these vulnerabilities that women face. So ultimately, the presence of both together is sort of what I think we're striving for, and what can lead us to some of the best reporting and some of the best coverage. So I agree with you in that sense. Thank you very much for your comment. And thanks to all of you. This was a great conversation.